The grand ballroom was alive with soft lights reflecting off crystal chandeliers, casting a warm glow across the polished marble floor. The air smelled faintly of roses and expensive perfume, a mixture that seemed to define the elegance of the evening. Tables draped in white cloths were scattered around, each decorated with delicate flower arrangements, fine silverware and sparkling glassware. Guests in long gowns and tailored suits moved gracefully, exchanging polite greetings and laughter that blended into a gentle hum. At the center of this scene was the piano. Its glossy black surface seemed to demand attention, standing tall on a small stage as if waiting for someone worthy to approach it. A few guests had paused near it, admiring its craftsmanship, but it remained untouched for most of the evening. It was more than just an instrument. It was a symbol of status, refinement, and control. In a room like this, everything had meaning. Every movement observed and measured. Among the crowd, the young woman moved with quiet purpose. She was dressed simply, but with a neatness that made her stand out in a subtle way. Her uniform, which identified her as a server, contrasted sharply with the flowing gowns and sharp suits around her. Yet she carried herself with a confidence that belied her role. She had worked these events for years, learning how to anticipate guest needs and navigate the delicate social landscape with ease. Tonight, though, she felt a different kind of tension, a pull that drew her toward the piano. Across the room, the CEO was holding court. He had the presence of someone used to attention, the kind of person whose gaze alone could shift the mood of a gathering. As he sipped his drink and spoke to the influential guests around him, he noticed the young woman approaching the piano. His eyes narrowed slightly, a smirk playing on his lips. He was not accustomed to anyone in the room challenging the unwritten rules, especially someone in a server's uniform. In his mind, she had crossed a line simply by daring to step close to the instrument that symbolized the refined world he dominated. The young woman paused for a moment at the edge of the stage, taking a deep breath. Her fingers hovered just above the keys, feeling the smooth surface under her touch. Memories of her childhood flooded her mind. The first time she had played a piano in her family home, the hours spent practicing in secret, the music that had been her companion through every challenge. This piano, though larger and more polished than anything she had played before, felt like a bridge connecting her past to the present. She knew the risk, but she also knew that some things were worth standing up for, even if it meant facing scorn. Guests began to notice her presence, the gentle hush of conversation giving way to curious glances. Some whispered to each other, their expressions a mix of intrigue and discomfort. In this environment, deviation from the expected path was always noticed. The CEO, watching her closely, allowed his smirk to grow, believing that a subtle jeer would keep her in her place. He raised his voice just enough for the nearby guests to hear, a comment dripping with condescension, questioning why she thought she could touch the piano. The words, though brief, carried the weight of authority and expectation. The room seemed to hold its breath. The young woman's heart raced, but she did not flinch. She had learned long ago that dignity was not given by others. It was claimed by those willing to stand firm in their truth. She let her hands rest lightly on the keys, feeling the cold smoothness beneath her fingers. For a moment there was silence. Not the polite, subdued kind, but a thick, expectant silence that pressed against the walls, making even the chandeliers seem to pause in their gentle twinkle. Around the ballroom, the reactions were varied. Some guests shifted uneasily, unsure how to respond. They were accustomed to the CEO's dominance, his sharp tongue and cutting remarks setting the tone for the evening. Others leaned in, intrigued by the audacity of the young woman, sensing that something unexpected was about to unfold. The whispers grew quieter as more people stopped mid-conversation, their attention drawn to the center stage where she stood poised, unshaken. The young woman closed her eyes briefly, centering herself. She remembered her family's words, the encouragement she had received despite the obstacles placed before her because of her background. Her ancestors had faced prejudice, and through resilience and determination they had left a legacy of strength and dignity. She drew on that history, letting it infuse her with calm and focus. This was not just about a piano or a single moment of confrontation. It was about honor, pride, and the courage to assert one's place in the world. The CEO, sensing a challenge to his control, straightened slightly, his posture rigid, his expression tightening. He had underestimated the young woman's composure, expecting hesitation or retreat. Instead, she emanated a quiet confidence that unsettled him more than any overt confrontation could have. In the eyes of the guests, the dynamic was shifting, and some began to recognize the subtle power in restraint and poise. As she prepared to play, the young woman adjusted her posture, ensuring every movement was deliberate and graceful. She did not rush. Each motion was measured, signaling that she was fully present in the moment. Her fingers finally pressed down on the keys, producing a single clear note. It rang through the ballroom, pure and resonant, capturing the attention of everyone in the room. Conversations halted completely, and even the clinking of glasses seemed to fade into the background. The note lingered, echoing faintly against the walls, and the young woman allowed herself a small, almost imperceptible smile. She was no longer merely a server in a uniform. She was a musician, a descendant of a proud lineage, a person who had chosen to rise above the constraints imposed by others. The room's energy shifted subtly, the air thick with anticipation as guests waited to see what would happen next. The moment had become a crossroads, a test not just of skill but of courage, and the young woman stood ready to meet it. In that instant, the contrast between the CEO and the young woman became stark. He embodied authority, wealth, and social dominance, yet his influence relied heavily on the compliance and fear of others. She, on the other hand, drew strength from experience, heritage, and inner resolve, a combination that no social standing could diminish. The subtle tension between them set the stage for what was about to unfold, a silent battle in which dignity and talent were the true instruments of power. The guests watched intently, sensing that this was more than just a momentary disruption. The young woman's presence at the piano challenged unspoken hierarchies, questioning the assumptions that had gone unchallenged for so long. Her stillness and focus conveyed a message louder than any words could. Courage and self-respect were forces to be reckoned with, capable of commanding attention even in the most intimidating circumstances. With her fingers poised, she let the music begin to flow, soft at first, hesitant yet filled with emotion. Each note carried history, struggle, hope, and determination, resonating with the listeners on a level beyond mere performance. The sound filled the ballroom, blending with the soft hum of curiosity and awe, creating a cocoon of attention around her. Even the CEO, who had expected mockery or retreat, found himself unprepared for the beauty and power emanating from the young woman's skill. The room, once a place dominated by social posturing and rigid etiquette, transformed. The piano became the center of gravity, drawing focus away from wealth, titles, and preconceived notions. The young woman's presence demanded recognition, not because she sought it, but because she embodied it naturally. The audience, silent yet fully engaged, witnessed a moment of transformation, one that defied expectations and hinted at the profound impact an individual could have when they embraced their full potential. As the music began to build, carrying a depth and richness that captivated every listener, the young woman remained poised, her face calm, her eyes reflecting concentration and subtle pride. She had claimed this space, if only for a brief moment, and in doing so, challenged the assumptions of everyone who had underestimated her. The piano, once a symbol of unattainable refinement, had become a bridge connecting her past, her heritage, and her present courage, resonating in ways that words could never capture. The CEO, feeling the weight of the shift, tightened his jaw. He realized, though he would not admit it aloud, that the young woman had taken control of the room in a manner far beyond his reach. Authority and arrogance could only go so far. The quiet strength, skill, and dignity she displayed commanded a different kind of respect, one that could not be bought or forced. In that moment, the dynamics of power, expectation, and recognition were quietly but irrevocably altered, setting the stage for what would follow in the minutes to come. The room had grown quieter, the hum of conversations fading to a soft murmur. Eyes that had wandered now focused intently on the young woman at the piano. The CEO, sensing that his authority was being challenged, decided to intervene. His voice, sharp and deliberate, cut through the stillness. "Do you really think you belong there?" he asked, though it was more of a jeer than a question. The words were meant to embarrass, to remind everyone of her place in the social hierarchy, and to show that someone in her position should know her limits. Guests around them shifted uncomfortably. Some looked down, pretending to be occupied with their glasses while while others glanced at one another, uncertain how to react. A few whispered behind their hands, speculating on the audacity of the young woman to stand so boldly under the gaze of such an influential figure. There was an uneasy tension in the air, a mixture of curiosity, admiration, and social fear. The young woman's hands hovered above the piano keys for a brief moment longer, feeling the cool surface beneath her fingers. Her pulse quickened, not from fear but from determination. She could feel the weight of everyone's expectations, or rather their assumptions, but she refused to let them dictate her actions. She had faced judgment before in different forms and from different people, and had always relied on her inner strength to guide her. This was no different. She drew a deep breath and let her hands settle lightly on the keys, ready to respond not with words but with action. The CEO's smirk remained, though there was a hint of uncertainty behind it now. He had assumed that his public ridicule would make her retreat, perhaps fluster her or even cause her to run back into the safety of the staff-only area. Instead, she remained steady, calm, and poised, as if the room's scrutiny had no effect on her. For the first time that evening, he realized that influence and intimidation alone might not always command the response he desired. Guests who had been watching started to lean forward slightly, their curiosity piqued. There was an unspoken agreement among them that they were witnessing something unusual. It was rare, in this world of polished manners and controlled interactions, to see such a direct challenge to authority, especially from someone whose job, by social definition, was to serve rather than to be seen. Their fascination grew, mingled with a subtle tension as they wondered what she would do next. The young woman began to play, her fingers moving with precision and confidence. The notes started softly, almost hesitantly, as if testing the waters of the room, but with every passing moment, the music became more assured, flowing effortlessly across the keys. The melody she created was not just technical, it carried emotion, history, and a sense of purpose. Each note seemed to resonate with the crowd in a way that words could not, drawing their attention and admiration naturally. The CEO's expression changed subtly as he listened. His amusement slowly gave way to a flicker of concern. The very tool he had tried to use against her, the audience's perception of her role and social standing, was being transformed by her skill. She was commanding attention, not through confrontation or defiance, but through talent and composure. This shift unsettled him because it was unexpected and uncontrollable. No amount of money, title, or status could counteract the natural respect and focus she was evoking from the guests. The guests themselves were caught between admiration and disbelief. Some leaned closer, listening intently, captivated by the beauty and emotion of the performance. Others whispered quietly to their companions, acknowledging the skill and courage it took to maintain such composure under scrutiny. Even those who had initially been skeptical found themselves drawn in, unable to ignore the impact of her presence and talent. The room, which had been tense and uncertain moments before, began to transform into a space of quiet awe. The young woman did not look at the CEO. Her gaze was focused on the piano, her fingers moving with rhythm and precision. She allowed the music to speak for her, conveying strength, dignity, and calmness. Every note she played told a story of resilience, of persistence in the face of judgment, and of a quiet confidence that no amount of ridicule could shake. The audience responded unconsciously, their emotions being guided by the melody rather than the social structure of the room. As the music continued, the CEO shifted uneasily. He attempted a subtle cough to regain attention, a small attempt to reassert authority. Some guests noticed and smiled discreetly, understanding his efforts as futile. The young woman's presence and skill had already redirected the room's focus. She had turned the tables without confrontation, showing that composure and talent could speak louder than derision. The whispers around the room grew softer as more guests became fully immersed in the music. The melody flowed like water, filling every corner of the ballroom, washing away the earlier tension. People's initial discomfort began to melt into quiet appreciation. They watched as the young woman played, realizing that the elegance of her performance was not just in the music, but in the courage it took to claim her space and defy expectation in a setting dominated by social hierarchy. For the young woman, the act of playing was both a personal triumph and a statement. Each note reinforced her presence, her right to occupy the space and her ability to influence the atmosphere without a word spoken. She had learned long ago that power could manifest in many forms, not just through wealth or status. In this moment, she embodied that truth fully. The piano was no longer a symbol of inaccessibility. It had become an instrument through which she expressed dignity, resilience, and artistry. The CEO, observing silently, could feel the shift in energy. His initial intention to ridicule had backfired, leaving him exposed to the realization that authority based solely on social position could be fragile. He had underestimated the young woman's resolve, and the room had already acknowledged her worth before he could attempt to reassert control. This subtle, unspoken defeat was more profound than any argument or confrontation could have been. Meanwhile, the guests were visibly moved. Some had tears in their eyes, touched by the combination of skill and courage they were witnessing. Others exchanged glances, sharing silent recognition of the young woman's quiet power. The room had become a collective audience to a display that transcended social boundaries, a reminder that respect and admiration are earned through action and character, rather than status alone. The young woman's music swelled, reaching a gentle crescendo. She did not rush or force it. Each movement was intentional, conveying a balance of emotion and technical mastery. Her presence at the piano was commanding, not in an aggressive way, but with a quiet authority that drew everyone's attention naturally. The audience, previously held by curiosity, was now fully captivated, their focus and respect earned effortlessly by the act of skillful, heartfelt performance. The CEO, feeling a mixture of frustration and reluctant admiration, remained silent. He recognized that his usual tactics would not work here. The young woman's calmness and determination had created a scenario in which neither wealth nor status could regain dominance. It was a lesson in humility, though one he would struggle to acknowledge openly. Around him, the guests were acknowledging it unconsciously through their attention and engagement, and he could not disrupt the flow without appearing petty or petty-minded. Time seemed to stretch as the young woman continued to play. Each note resonated, building a connection with the room and leaving the audience suspended between awe and admiration. Her performance was a testament not just to her musical ability, but to her courage, self-assurance, and poise. She had faced ridicule and social pressure and had responded with artistry, demonstrating that true strength often speaks in ways beyond verbal confrontation. The tension that had hung in the air earlier was gradually replaced by a shared experience. Guests were no longer observing from a distance. They were participants in the moment, engaged emotionally and intellectually. The young woman had shifted the dynamics of the room entirely, transforming what had been a test of social hierarchy into a moment of communal respect and quiet reverence. As the music reached a softer, more reflective passage, the audience remained still, captivated by the nuance and emotion embedded in every note. The young woman's face reflected concentration, grace, and a subtle satisfaction. She had successfully navigated the challenge, responding not with confrontation, but with talent and dignity. The CEO, though still present, was now overshadowed by her presence and the power of the moment she had created. In these minutes, the young woman had not only played a piano, she had reshaped perceptions, challenged assumptions, and commanded respect. The audience recognized the courage it took to remain composed and assertive in a space dominated by authority and social expectation. The room was transformed from a scene of hierarchy and power into a stage where skill, resilience, and grace spoke louder than titles or wealth, setting the tone for what would follow in the next part of the evening. The moment her fingers began to move across the piano, the entire room seemed to shift. The soft, graceful notes filled the air like a gentle breeze, carrying with them a story that words could never tell. The young woman's touch was both delicate and powerful, each note blending seamlessly into the next. The crowd, which had moments ago been filled with quiet whispers and uncertain glances, was now completely still. Every pair of eyes was fixed on her, every ear tuned to the melody that poured from her fingertips. She played not as a performer trying to impress, but as someone sharing a part of her soul. The music rose and fell like the rhythm of a heartbeat, steady yet filled with emotion. It spoke of strength and sorrow, of memories carried deep within, and of pride that refused to fade despite hardship. In that moment, the ballroom no longer belonged to the wealthy guests or the powerful CEO. It belonged to her. Her expression remained calm, though her heart raced. Every note she played came from something real, a memory or her mother's laughter, her father's encouragement, the long nights she had practiced on an old piano that had lost a few keys but not its warmth. She thought of her family's history, of the generations who had fought quietly for respect, who had endured more than anyone in that glittering room could imagine. This was her moment to honor them, and she gave it everything she had. The CEO, sitting nearby with his glass untouched, watched her closely. His smirk had disappeared long ago. His expression was difficult to read, part surprise, part disbelief. He had never expected that a woman he had mocked would hold the attention of everyone in the room, including himself. He could not look away, though he wanted to. There was something in her music that made him uneasy, something pure that stripped away the illusions of superiority he had built his life around. Around the room, emotions stirred. A woman in a silver gown blinked rapidly as if fighting back tears. A man who had been whispering earlier now sat frozen, his posture softening as the melody filled the air. Even the servers had paused in their duties, watching from the edges of the room, their eyes wide with pride and admiration. The young woman had not just taken a seat at the piano, she had claimed her space in a world that had tried to keep her invisible. The notes danced higher, the rhythm growing more confident. Each sound seemed to echo through the walls, carrying with it an energy that wrapped around every listener. The grand chandeliers above shimmered as if they, too, were reacting to the power of the moment. The young woman's fingers moved faster now, guided by instinct more than thought. Her body swayed gently, her face calm but her eyes alive with emotion. As she played, a memory flashed in her mind, the first time she had ever touched a piano as a child. She had been too small to reach all the keys, but she remembered the sound of the first note she ever played. It had filled her heart with wonder, and from that moment she knew music would always be her language. Now, years later, that same wonder returned, but this time it was mixed with purpose. She was not just playing for herself. She was playing for everyone who had ever been underestimated, ignored, or looked down upon. The CEO shifted in his seat, his hand tightening around his glass. He could feel the shift in the atmosphere, and for the first time in a long while, he was not in control. The audience was not looking at him. No one was hanging on his words or watching for his reaction. Their attention, their admiration, their emotions all belonged to her. He felt a twinge of frustration mixed with something unfamiliar, something close to respect, though his pride would not allow him to admit it. The melody softened, the tempo slowing, as if the young woman was allowing the room to breathe again. She looked up briefly, meeting the eyes of a few guests who smiled gently in silent encouragement. Their faces reflected something she had not expected, genuine admiration, not pity. That simple exchange filled her with strength. She was no longer alone in her fight to be seen. The sound of the piano seemed to fill every corner of the room, seeping into the hearts of everyone present. The young woman had transformed the grand ballroom from a place of status and display into a place of unity, even if just for a few minutes. People who had come to flaunt their wealth or network for business now sat quietly, humbled by the power of music and the grace of the person playing it. As the piece continued, the guests began to see her differently. She was no longer the waitress who had served them drinks earlier in the evening. She was an artist, a storyteller, a reflection of something beautiful and real. Her music had stripped away the invisible walls that divided the room, the lines between the powerful and the ordinary, the privileged and the unseen. For that brief moment, everyone was equal, bound together by the emotion her music evoked. The CEO looked around, noticing the change in the room. His usual circle of admirers had turned their attention away from him completely. He tried to force a polite smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. There was a quiet sense of defeat building within him, though he refused to show it. He could sense that this moment, simple as it was, had undermined everything he had believed about power and worth. The young woman, lost in her music, had no time to think about him. Her focus was on the sound, the feeling, and the invisible connection between her and the people listening. Each note told a story of endurance and self-belief. She poured herself into the performance, letting her emotions guide her hands. The song rose once more, the chords rich and deep, carrying the kind of passion that can only come from lived experience. The audience was spellbound. No one moved. The waiters had stopped walking between tables. Even the quiet hum of the air conditioning seemed to fade away. All that existed was the music. Every heart in the room seemed to beat in rhythm with the piano. It was as if time itself had paused to witness the moment. When the music reached its peak, the young woman's expression changed slightly. Her eyes closed and her fingers struck the final high note with precision and feeling. The sound lingered in the air, hanging there like a soft echo of everything she had just shared. Then slowly the last note faded into silence. For several seconds no one moved. It was as if the room had collectively forgotten how to breathe. The silence was complete, no whispers, no shifting chairs, no clinking glasses. Just stillness. The CEO stared at her, speechless, his face unreadable. Around the room, guests exchanged glances, trying to process what they had just experienced. Then, a single pair of hands began to clap. The sound was hesitant at first, but it broke the silence. Another joined in, then another, until the entire room erupted in applause. It wasn't the polite kind of clapping that usually followed performances at social events. It was genuine, heartfelt appreciation. People rose from their seats, clapping louder, their faces filled with admiration. The young woman stood slowly, her hands trembling slightly from the emotion of the moment. She gave a small bow, her eyes glistening. She didn't expect the reaction, but she felt it deep in her heart. The applause wasn't just for her talent, it was for her courage, her strength, and the quiet way she had challenged an entire room's perception without saying a single word. The CEO, now standing awkwardly among the cheering crowd, forced himself to clap as well. It felt strange to him, unnatural, but he could not ignore the power of what he had witnessed. For the first time in years, he felt humbled. He looked down, realizing how easily arrogance could blind someone to real worth. His earlier jeer now echoed in his mind, but it sounded foolish and small against the memory of her music. As the applause continued, the young woman smiled softly and stepped away from the piano. A few guests approached her, offering kind words and genuine praise. One of the organizers of the event even invited her to perform again later in the evening. She thanked them all with quiet grace, still processing the magnitude of what had happened. The room slowly returned to life, but something had changed. The laughter that followed was softer, the conversations warmer. People looked at each other differently, as if reminded that dignity and talent could come from anywhere. The young woman had not just played music. She had shifted the energy of the entire room. As she walked toward the back of the hall, a few servers nodded at her proudly. They had seen what she had done, and in her they saw hope. She had stood up not with defiance, but with grace and strength. She had proven that respect is earned through authenticity, not demanded through power. The CEO remained by his table, silent and reflective. He knew the night would move on, that people would eventually forget the details, but he also knew he would not. Something in that moment had left a mark on him, something that challenged the way he saw the world and himself. The young woman paused at the door and glanced back once. The piano gleamed under the soft lights, still and silent once more. She smiled, knowing she had left a piece of herself there in that music, in that room. And though the night would continue, nothing would ever quite be the same again. The applause began to fade, but the silence that followed carried more weight than any sound could. The air in the ballroom felt different now, softer yet charged with something unspoken. People were still processing what they had just witnessed. The young woman had returned to her place near the side of the room, her head slightly bowed, trying to collect herself. But even though she had stepped away from the piano, the echo of her music still lingered in every corner. The CEO sat frozen, staring at the piano as if it had betrayed him. His once confident expression had melted into something uncertain, almost vulnerable. For years he had prided himself on controlling every situation, on being the loudest voice in any room. But tonight, that control had slipped through his fingers like sand. It wasn't taken from him. It was simply overshadowed by grace, talent, and truth. A few guests approached him, their smiles polite but distant. They congratulated him for hosting such a remarkable evening, though their eyes darted elsewhere, clearly more interested in the young woman who had just transformed the night. For the first time in his career, the CEO realized that he wasn't the center of attention, and the feeling stung more than he wanted to admit. Across the room, the young woman stood quietly, her hands clasped together. A few people came up to her offering soft words of praise. She thanked each one humbly, her voice calm but filled with quiet pride. She wasn't seeking attention. She was simply grateful that her message had reached the people it needed to. The fact that her music had changed the atmosphere of the room was enough. She didn't need validation. She had found peace in simply being true to herself. The CEO watched this from a distance, the faint sounds of laughter and conversation around him blending into a dull hum. He couldn't stop thinking about the moment she sat down at the piano. Her courage had caught him off guard. In his world, people followed rules, his rules, and anyone who stepped outside them was usually dismissed or corrected. But she hadn't challenged him with words or attitude. She had simply played, and that act alone had stripped away the power dynamics he depended on. He lifted his glass and stared into it, his reflection staring back. For the first time, he questioned himself. Had his success made him arrogant? Had he forgotten what it meant to truly respect others? The questions lingered, uncomfortable and sharp. He wanted to brush them aside, but the image of her at the piano refused to leave his mind. The music had done something to him, something he couldn't fully explain. It reminded him of the first time he had ever heard a live performance as a boy, before wealth and ambition hardened his heart. He remembered sitting in a small concert hall with his parents, listening to a pianist play with passion and joy. Back then, he had felt inspired, moved by something beyond himself. But over the years, that memory had faded under layers of ego and control. Now her performance had brought it all rushing back. The guests continued mingling, though the tone of the evening had changed completely. There was more sincerity in their conversations, more warmth in their smiles. The young woman's music had peeled back the layers of pretense that usually coated these kinds of gatherings. People were no longer showing off. They were connecting, genuinely moved by what they had witnessed. A middle-aged woman approached the CEO, her voice kind but firm. "That was beautiful, wasn't it?" she said softly, referring to the performance. "She has a gift," the CEO nodded slowly. "Yes," he admitted. "She does." The woman gave him a look that carried both approval and reproach. "Sometimes," she said gently, "we forget that grace doesn't come from power. It comes from the heart." And with that, she walked away, leaving him alone with his thoughts. He leaned back in his chair and let out a slow breath. Her words echoed in his mind, mingling with the music that still seemed to hum faintly in the air. He looked at the young woman again. She had gone back to her duties now, gracefully moving between tables, refilling glasses, offering smiles. There was no trace of pride or triumph in her demeanor, only quiet dignity. He was struck by the contrast. Here he was, a man with everything money could buy, and yet he felt small in her presence. She had nothing to prove, no wealth or title to display, and yet she had captured the respect of everyone in the room with a single song. It humbled him in a way that years of business and competition never could. At one point, their eyes met briefly. She gave him a small, polite smile before turning back to her work. It wasn't a smile of arrogance or victory. It was simply an acknowledgement, a gesture of peace. That moment unsettled him more than any confrontation would have. It told him that she didn't need his approval to feel whole. She had already won something far greater. The evening carried on, but the usual energy of such gatherings was gone. Instead, there was a strange calm in the air. The clinking of glasses and quiet chatter filled the space, but the mood was reflective. Guests who had once admired the CEO's sharp wit and boldness now looked at him differently. Not with disdain, but with the subtle awareness that something had shifted. The night belonged to someone else now, someone who had taught them all a silent lesson in humility. Later, as the event began to wind down, the CEO stepped outside for some air. The night was cool, and the distant sound of city traffic filled the silence. He loosened his tie and looked up at the stars, feeling the weight of his thoughts pressing down on him. The image of her at the piano replayed again and again in his mind. The calm in her eyes, the steadiness in her hands, the confidence that came from knowing who she was. He realized something then. True power didn't come from titles or influence. It came from authenticity, from the courage to be yourself even when others try to put you in a box. He had spent years building walls around himself, mistaking fear for control, arrogance for confidence. But tonight those walls had cracked. And though it made him uncomfortable, there was a strange sense of relief in that. Inside, the young woman stood by the piano once more, though this time she didn't play. She ran her fingers lightly along the keys as if saying goodbye. The piano had been her voice that evening, and it had spoken louder than she ever could. A few guests who were still lingering approached her again, thanking her sincerely. One even asked where she had learned to play, and she answered simply, "At home." Her humility only deepened their admiration. They wanted to know more, but she didn't offer details. She had no desire to turn her story into a spectacle. She preferred to leave the night as it was, a moment of quiet truth. When the CEO returned inside, he saw her again by the piano. He hesitated before walking over, unsure of what to say. He wasn't used to apologizing, especially in public, but something inside him urged him to try. "You played beautifully," he said quietly when he finally approached her. She looked at him, surprised but calm. "Thank you," she replied softly. He cleared his throat, the words heavy on his tongue. "I may have spoken out of turn earlier," he admitted. "It was wrong of me." Her expression softened, but she didn't let him off easily. "People say things they don't always mean," she said. "What matters is if they learn from it." The simplicity of her response struck him harder than any long speech could have. He nodded slowly, realizing that she had given him a second chance, not through forgiveness but through understanding. "I did learn something tonight," he said finally. "More than I expected to." She smiled, just a small curve of her lips, and turned back to the piano. "Then maybe the night wasn't wasted," she said quietly. He stood there for a moment, unsure how to respond. Then he simply nodded and stepped away, feeling lighter somehow, though he couldn't explain why. It wasn't redemption, not yet, but it was a start. The guests began to leave, their conversation still revolving around the performance. Many of them would remember the night for years, not for the luxury or the speeches, but for the moment when one woman reminded them all what grace truly looked like. Her music had reached beyond social boundaries, leaving a lasting mark on everyone present. The CEO lingered by the door for a long time, watching as she quietly helped clear the last of the tables. She didn't know it, but she had changed something deep within him. He no longer saw her as a server who had stepped out of line, but as someone who had shown him what dignity really meant. And though he was too proud to say it aloud, he was grateful. As the lights dimmed and the staff began to close up, the young woman took one last look at the piano. It stood there silently, gleaming under the soft glow of the chandeliers. She smiled faintly, feeling the calm satisfaction that comes only after facing fear and turning it into strength. She had not planned to make a statement that night, but sometimes the most powerful moments happen when you simply follow your heart. Outside, the night was quiet. The CEO stepped into his car, lost in thought. As the driver pulled away, he looked back at the hotel one last time. For the first time in a long while, he felt something he hadn't felt in years. Respect not just for someone else, but for the kind of truth that cannot be bought or controlled. The silence in the car was comforting. It reminded him of that same silence that had filled the room after her last note, a silence that spoke louder than any applause ever could. The morning after the gala arrived, with a soft golden light that streamed through the hotel windows. The world outside seemed calm, unaware of how deeply one night had changed several people inside that grand hall. The air carried the faint scent of coffee and pastries as the hotel staff began their day. Among them was the young woman who had played the piano the night before. She walked through the quiet corridors with her usual calmness, though her mind was still replaying the night's events. She hadn't expected to draw so much attention. When she sat at that piano, she wasn't thinking about anyone in the room. She was thinking about her grandmother, who had taught her how to play when she was a child. Her grandmother used to say, "Music speaks when words can't." Last night proved those words true. The piano had spoken for her in a way she never could have with just speech. As she reached the empty ballroom, she paused for a moment. The place that had been full of chatter and laughter just hours ago was now silent. The piano still stood in its place, untouched since she last played it. She smiled softly, remembering the look on everyone's faces when the final note faded. That silence wasn't uncomfortable. It had been full of realization, like the entire room was holding its breath together. She took a seat near the window and watched the sunlight dance on the floor. She wasn't proud in a boastful way. Instead, she felt grateful. Something deep inside her told her that what happened wasn't just about music. It was about dignity, courage, and grace. It was about standing tall without needing to raise your voice. Meanwhile, the CEO had a restless night. Sleep wouldn't come easily. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw her sitting at the piano, her fingers moving gently across the keys, her face calm but full of emotion. He had been in countless meetings, faced tough negotiations, and delivered speeches in front of thousands, but nothing had ever unsettled him the way her quiet strength had. He kept thinking about the words she said to him. What matters is if they learn from it. Those words had followed him like a shadow. By morning, he decided to act on that thought. He wasn't sure how, but he knew he couldn't just move on and pretend nothing had happened. Something in him had shifted. He felt the weight of his behavior, the arrogance he had carried for years. It was as if her performance had held up a mirror to his soul, and for the first time he saw himself clearly. Later that day, he asked one of the hotel managers to arrange a meeting. He didn't want to cause a scene or draw attention. He just wanted to speak with her. When she was told that the CEO wanted to see her, she hesitated. Part of her didn't want to relive that uncomfortable moment, but another part of her sensed that maybe something good could come from it. They met in one of the smaller lounges, away from the crowd. The CEO stood as she entered, something he rarely did for anyone. His usual commanding presence seemed softer now, almost unsure. She greeted him politely and waited for him to speak. "Thank you for coming," he said quietly. "I know I don't deserve much of your time, but I wanted to say something." She nodded, her expression neutral but attentive. "I was wrong," he said, the words coming out slower than he expected. "I was disrespectful and ignorant. I made assumptions that I shouldn't have. Last night showed me just how mistaken I was. You taught me something valuable, something I needed to remember." She looked at him, surprised by the sincerity in his tone. "What did you remember?" she asked softly. He took a deep breath. "That respect isn't about position. It's about humanity. I've spent years measuring people by what they own, what they wear, who they know, but last night reminded me that real worth can't be measured that way. You reminded me what grace looks like." There was a long pause. She didn't rush to respond. She wanted to see if his words were genuine, and they were. She could see it in his eyes. For the first time there was no pride, no arrogance, only humility. "I appreciate that," she said finally. "I didn't play to prove anything. I just wanted to share something that meant a lot to me." "And you did," he replied quietly. "You shared more than music. You shared a lesson I won't forget." They spoke for a few more minutes, no grand speeches, no dramatic apologies, just an honest exchange between two people who had seen each other differently for the first time. Before she left, he offered his hand. She hesitated, then shook it. It wasn't forgiveness that passed between them, but understanding. Sometimes that's more powerful. As the day went on, word of the previous night's event continued to spread among the guests and staff. Some called it magical, others said it was humbling. For many, it became a story they would tell for years. The night a young woman's music silenced an entire room and softened even the hardest heart. That evening, when her shift ended, she returned once more to the piano. The ballroom was empty again, but this time the silence felt comforting. She sat down and played softly, just for herself. The melody was gentle, almost like a conversation with her grandmother. As she played, she thought about how strange life could be, how one small act done with sincerity could ripple through so many people's lives. She didn't think of herself as a hero or a symbol. She was simply a person who refused to let someone else define her. That, she realized, was what true freedom felt like. The CEO, on the other hand, found himself changing in small ways. Over the next few weeks, his employees noticed he was less impatient, more willing to listen. He began to see the people around him as individuals, not just roles. He started asking questions, learning about their lives, their stories. The arrogance that once clouded his judgment began to fade. The world, he realized, was much bigger than the narrow lens through which he had been viewing it. A month later, the hotel hosted another event, a smaller one this time, for charity. The CEO attended again, but this time he wasn't the loudest voice in the room. He listened, observed, and smiled genuinely. And when the young woman walked by, he greeted her respectfully, not as a superior to an employee, but as one human being to another. He even asked if she would play again. She hesitated for a moment, but then agreed. When she sat at the piano and began to play, the room once again fell silent. But this silence was different. It wasn't the stunned quiet of shock, it was one of appreciation, gratitude, and connection. As she played, the CEO closed his eyes, letting the music wash over him. He thought about how strange it was that something as simple as a song could carry so much power. He felt lighter, almost at peace. The music filled the space not with pride or judgment, but with something pure and healing. When the song ended, the applause was warm and genuine. The CEO joined in, this time without hesitation. There was no pretense, no competition, just respect. After the event, he approached her once more. "You've inspired me more than you know," he said. "Not just last month, but tonight too. You remind me of what matters," she smiled kindly. "Then maybe that's what music is meant to do." They stood there for a moment, not as employer and employee, but as two people who had learned something about themselves and the world around them. In that moment, there was peace, quiet, steady, and real. As the evening ended and guests began to leave, the young woman stayed behind for a few minutes, looking at the piano again. It wasn't just an instrument anymore, it was a reminder of courage, patience, and truth. She touched one of the keys softly, the note ringing clear and gentle in the empty room. The CEO walked out into the night, feeling the cool air against his face. The city lights shimmered, and for the first time in a long while he felt grounded. He had built an empire, but it had taken a single song to remind him of the simple beauty of being kind. He smiled to himself, not out of pride, but out of peace. Some lessons, he thought, don't come from books or business. They come from moments that catch you by surprise and refuse to let you stay the same. Back inside, the young woman closed the lid of the piano and stood quietly for a moment before turning off the lights. She knew the night would end, but its meaning would stay. As she walked away, her steps were light, her heart calm. The room behind her fell into silence once again, the kind of silence that doesn't feel empty but full of truth. And in that stillness, it was clear. One act of grace had changed everything.